Cincinnati. I'm now Cincinnati. What a team, what a team, what a team. To 80, how they scream, how they scream, how they scream. Hello, and welcome to another edition of We Love Our Team. Along with my partner, Randy Freaking, I'm Jack Reiner, and we are joined today by Keith O'Brien. Keith is a New York Times best-selling author whose works include Fly Girls, Paradise Falls, Outside Shot, and most recently, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball, which the Wall Street Journal says is compulsively readable and wholly terrific. Keith grew up in Cincinnati and attended Northwestern University. Keith, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, guys. My pleasure.
We've been wanting to get you on the podcast for a while now. Yeah, we never know when our studio audience is going to break into applause. So, but we've been wanting to get you for a while, and that was even before we knew you grew up in Cincinnati, honestly. So, I want to ask the burning question: where'd you go to high school?
Of course, I knew it was coming. I went to St. Xavier High School. How about you guys?
Oh, okay. Well, Randy went to St. X.
No,
I did go to St. X. Jack went to LaSalle High School. I grew up in Finneytown, Keith, so I could practically walk to St. X.
So we got some GSL guys here, then I guess, right?
That's right. We got GCL, and we've covered. We've had, let's see, I know we've had at least one guest who's, we've covered the GCL pretty well. We've had a Moeller guy on, we've had a Elder guy on, so good to have another bomber to join Randy. It's good. So, were you a Reds fan growing up, Keith?
Of course, yeah. So, I was born in the 70s, but too young to remember the Big Red Machine teams, but as you know, even in the early 80s, you're growing up on the stories of those teams and the myth of those teams. I certainly remember when Pete Rose was traded back to the Reds in the summer of 1984. I remember exactly where I was, I think like every Reds fan on the night that he set the all-time hit record. And I remember all those feelings in 1989 that all of us had as baseball fans, in the midst of the gambling scandal.
So, you're born in the 70s. So as you came of age, obviously you remember the Pete coming back. And who were some of your favorite players then in sort of your era as a Reds fan?
So, my favorite player from my era was without question Eric Davis. He comes up in the 80s. Right in the time when, I'm playing not whole baseball and, every kid in Cincinnati in the 80s, was swinging that bat, like Eric Davis in the batter's box, which I'm sure did nothing for our swings and probably actually hurt our swings. But Eric Davis was my guy without question.
Hey, Keith, I once had a dream of going to Northwestern, but didn't follow through on that dream. I went to the University of Dayton instead. I'm just wondering, did you go there for the journalism degree?
Yeah, I wish. When I went to Northwestern, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And so I was a history major, actually. I was at the end of my freshman year, I realized that I did, want to do journalism. I was interested in journalism, but and I did actually apply to switch schools to the School of Journalism to Medill at Northwestern. But in order to do that, I was going to have to repeat my freshman year. And I really had no interest in paying a fifth year of the Northwestern tuition, which was quite high then, is even, of course, higher now. So I stuck with my history degree so I could graduate in 4 years.
When did you? So was it around college that you thought about maybe getting into writing and being or journalism or writing as a profession?
I knew I wanted to do something around writing in college, but it wasn't until after college that I started to get some journalism internships and work at small newspapers, and just started working my way up from there in the classic way.
Yeah. Did you read Were you a reader when you were younger?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can't. One thing I always say is you can't write anything unless you're reading. I mean, there's a formula for storytelling. It's not, it's not always the same, but there's essentially a code to do what we do, and the only way to learn the code and to find your voice and find your way is to read. So yeah, I read a lot for sure.
Awesome.
I suspect you've read more books than Pete Rose. Would that be a fair assumption?
Well, Pete famously said in 1970, when he was 29 years old, that he'd only read one book cover to cover in his life, and that was his first autobiography, which came out that year, the Pete Rose autobiography. That he told the press in 1970 that was the first book he ever read cover to cover. I, there's a lot of, I would say in general that Pete Rose has earned all the criticism he receives, and there's certainly plenty of jokes that people can make, about his lack of education. I will say, Pete is also acutely aware of that, and he told me, because I did have a chance to interview him, that one of his regrets was that that he hadn't taken school seriously, that he hadn't taken his education seriously.
Uh, were there any baseball books that you liked as a kid that you read and remember reading as a younger man that stand out to you?
Yeah, I mean, not really as a kid exactly, but certainly by the time I was in college, there were a few. One author that I greatly admire and devoured in college was David Halberstam. Yep. David Halberstam was a journalist at the Nashville Tennessean, and then later the New York Times. He leaves the Times to write books. Writes a number of books. The early ones aren't about sports, but later in his career, he begins to almost like have a pattern where he's writing a book about something else and then writing a book about sports, writing a book about something else, writing a book about sports. And David Halberstam's books on baseball are among my favorites. The Summer of '49, October 1964, The Teammates. These are all just incredible baseball books that I absolutely enjoyed as a young man.
Yeah, I told somebody that I thought he wrote the best book on baseball that I probably ever read, which in my view was October of '64. I thought he wrote the best basketball book I ever read, which was The Breaks of the Game, about the Portland Trailblazers. And he wrote a book about Bill Belichick called The Education of a Coach, which I thought was maybe the best football book I ever read. It's funny. I had just read October of 1964 a number of years ago, and I had the occasion to have lunch with Jim Bunning. He was at a luncheon, and I was at the same table with him. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Bunning, I just finished the book October 1964. Have you read that?" And he goes, "I lived that." Because a big piece of it was the Phillies choking down at the very end of the season with a big lead. And,
right.
I think my favorite book was The Boys of Summer by Roger Angel.
Roger Kahn, I think. Yeah, Roger Kahn.
Roger Kahn. Yeah. That was a great book.
Yeah.
That was a book I remember from my childhood.
Yeah, my parents gave that to me. That was my 14th birthday present. I still have that on my bookshelf. Not next to, but near the Pete Rose autobiography, which is on my bookshelf. I don't know, Randy, is it on your bookshelf, Randy?
I think it was the first book I ever read.
Wow. Wow.
Love it. How about an autobiography when you're only 7 years into the big leagues?
Yeah.
Well, he had just won, when that autobiography came out in 1970, he had just won back-to-back batting titles. So he was the two-time now reigning NL batting champion. And yeah, he cashed in, with an autobiography. that was celebrated certainly in Cincinnati. I've of course read all of Pete Rose's memoirs. He has written no fewer than a half and dozen of them, and by written I mean hired writers to write them for him. And you know, I would say two things about those memoirs. They're helpful to a historian, to a writer trying to do a biography. You get some insights into a person based on what they do or don't include in their memoirs. So they were a great resource for me for sure. But I will say, in general, Pete's autobiographies are really superficial on the details that you would want. On any kind of darkness or adversity. And so, when I was writing this book, when I was writing Charlie Hustle, and I did get access to Pete for a time, my goal was to push him, to discuss things, explain things that he hadn't before. And one thing I will say is, as someone who's been fortunate to interview probably thousands of people, is that when you interview a famous person, any famous person, they've told the same stories before and they've gotten the same questions before. And so, one goal you have to have as a writer is to get someone like that to color outside the lines of what they've already drawn before. And so that was a real focus of mine in my reporting here. And I will say, to Pete's credit, he did talk to me about things that he's never spoken about before. But he did also ultimately, shut down. I did 27 hours of recorded interviews with Pete Rose until he finally stopped calling me back, and I don't know why, but he still doesn't call me back today.
And so I definitely want to talk about the book in some more detail, but I'm just, I'm very interested in our guests and their their Reds fandom and memories that you have of things that stand out to you, either good things or bad things about the Reds growing up. So like, do you remember your first ball game that you went to?
I don't remember my first ball game. I do remember being at Johnny Bench's last game in 1983. That's my first memory of a ball game. I don't know that it was my first. I doubt it. I certainly remember, as I said before, Rose returning, the hit record, the fight with Pallone, the umpire, in 1988. And I will say, if there's a great memory from my childhood, it's what comes after Pete is banned. It's the 1990 World Series, the last World Series title for the Reds. That was, of course, a team that makes the World Series, but by rights and by all the odds makers, has no chance of beating the Oakland A's. And I grew up on the east side of town in Anderson Township, when on a clear night in particular, you could hear the fireworks from the stadium if something happened downtown.
Right.
And I remember game one of the World Series. It's home at Riverfront. The Reds are playing the A's, and Eric Davis, hits that home run. In my memory, it's the first inning, but maybe it was the second. I don't know. But in my memory, it's the first inning. And I remember I was in my bedroom. I was doing homework. I'm in high school at that time. And I heard the fireworks, and there was like a little delay, of course. And I ran out of my room into my parents' bedroom where they were watching on TV. And there was the home run that he had just hit, which is a slight tape delay. So, I'm a baseball fan. I'm a Reds fan. And that's one reason why I wanted to do the book. I felt that, all too often we had looked at Pete Rose's story through the prism of baseball instead of looking at it through the prism of humanity, through him being a man. And I think when you look at his story as the story of a man, an ordinary man from the west side of Cincinnati, that is just a far more compelling story. And of course, there's a lot of baseball in my book, as you know. But really, what I was trying to write was the story of a man.
I thought the analogy in the New York Times review was so good. They analogized Pete to Willie Loman from Death of a Salesman. And I thought that was right on.
Yeah, Willie Loman is a one of those literary characters that really resonates with me. So that analogy that the Times made was especially powerful for me. I'm certainly grateful for that, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. You know, uh, it it's easy to look at Pete Rose's story and to think about it in simple terms as someone who has this incredible rise and then someone who has this incredible fall. And he does. But what's interesting about it is that the decisions that lead to the fall are happening even while he's rising. And so that was one of the key things that I had to do with the narrative is, in the early 70s and throughout that decade, even into the 60s, when he's, a rookie and then winning those batting titles and writing that autobiography that we mentioned, he's already making choices and decisions in the shadows that really are going to lead him down a path to 1989 and his banishment from baseball. And so, he's rising. He's becoming this American icon. He was an American icon, and but he's making these decisions off stage, that people aren't seeing. That is going to ultimately lead to his own doom.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny because it was sort of like hiding in plain sight to a certain extent, because everybody knew that he was at River Downs. Any chance he got, he was down in Florida. You talked about the triple play of
Triple headers.
horse racing, dog racing, and then going to high lie. That Pete kind of took it to a whole new level. With it. And I'm not sure that I don't know if anybody ever really just early on spotted that as kind of a problem or an addiction. I mean, back then we didn't think of gambling as an addiction. It was just something people did, I guess. But,
Well, I think that's true. I think you're absolutely right. When you go back, even when you read the newspaper covers, there's times when the newspaper and the beat writers are writing about his presence at the racetrack in a sort of aw shucks chuckling kind of way. In the 1970s, when Sparky Anderson was the manager, Pete Rose would often be given the day off or a couple of days off at spring training during March Madness, so he could watch the games. And even that is noted at times in the game notes of the newspapers. Oh, Rose, didn't play today. At spring training, he was given the day off to enjoy the basketball games. And it's like, well, enjoy the basketball games, sure, because he was betting on them. And so, you're right. It was in plain sight. And one of the things that I think is crucial about, what I found and wrote about in the book is that by 1975, even, definitively, one of the peak watershed years of Rose's career, people are already worried about Pete Rose. NBC broadcaster Kurt Gowdy, who was the voice of baseball in the 70s, told a story that I unearthed in a film archive, actually there in Cincinnati at the Museum Center downtown. And Gowdy said that at the 1975 World Series at Fenway Park, that Johnny Bench approached him on the field asking for an intervention of sorts. In Gowdy's memory, Bench was worried because Rose was hanging out with, quote, bad guys. Who those guys were, I'm not really sure. I don't know what Bench was referring to, but I will say this. At the 1975 World Series, there is a man in the clubhouse who is one of Pete Rose's closest friends. His name was Mario Nunez, but everybody called him, quote, the Cuban. That was his nickname. And he was the maitre d' at Tampa Downs down in Florida, well connected in gambling circles. And the Cuban is in the clubhouse for the entirety of the postseason and hanging out with Rose. And Sparky Anderson loves the Cuban. In fact, Sparky will say that fall that the Cuban was their good luck charm. He was this portly little, Latino man with this outgoing personality. Sparky loved him, called him the good luck charm. He's in the clubhouse, and so Bench is concerned at a minimum by 1975. And by 1978, again, according to my reporting, there is some kind of meeting, secret meeting that happens in the office of Reds president Dick Wagner. And this meeting is before a game. It includes Wagner, it includes Rose, and it includes at least one official from Major League Baseball. And based on my reporting, the discussion that day was about gambling and bookies and Pete's debts to bookies. They're worried as early as 1978. That's 11 years before the banishment, but none of us know. Doesn't make headlines. There are no ramifications, no punishment, no suspension, no nothing. And I think, that is emblematic of two things. I think it's emblematic of the fact that this was a different era, where they did try to protect the biggest stars. And I think it's also emblematic of Pete's fame. I think one thing we have forgotten, even as Cincinnatians, even as Reds fans, I think we have forgotten why we ever cared about Pete Rose in the first place. Why he is an icon, why there is a statue of him outside the stadium in Cincinnati. I think we've forgotten. And so when you go back and you see the full story, you really do understand how big he was. He wasn't just one of the most famous baseball players in America by 1978. He was one of the most famous Americans, period.
No, I think that's right. How did you get him to cooperate? Because I think your biography stands apart by virtue of the fact that you had 27 hours with Pete. I mean, I don't think other people, I don't think anybody else, any other biographer had gotten that.
Yeah, he'd never spoken before to an author for a book unless he was, getting paid or had editorial control over that book. And to be clear, he was not getting paid here and did not have editorial control here. I got to Rose through Cincinnati guys. Everybody in Cincinnati knows who Pete Rose's pals are. As you know, Cincinnati is a little big city where we're all separated by 1 or 2 degrees. I mean, if we sat here and had a quick conversation about who we know and who we play golf with or who we go to church with, I bet you we all know collectively, a dozen people between us, right? So everybody in Cincinnati knows who Pete Rose's pals are. And that's where I started my reporting. I started doing interviews with them, and got access to them in part probably because of my own Cincinnati roots. But once I was sitting with them, they realized that, that there was value in this project. Even Pete Rose's closest friends and his defenders know that Pete has made many mistakes over the years and has shot himself in the foot many times. And one of the things I was, pitching here was that this is a time for reckoning. Pete Rose is now 83 years old. When I started my reporting, he was 80. Everyone around him is also, in their 70s or 80s, the people who live this story with him. And so this is really, in some ways, maybe the last time to get this story on the record. It's a time for reckoning. And his friends recognized that and made an introduction for me. And Pete was thrilled to talk. And we did a lot of interviews on the phone, and then 3 days of interviews in person in Las Vegas. And when I went back and went through the transcripts of those interviews, there were certain lines or phrases that Pete would say, especially in our earliest interviews, that I think sort of maybe indicated, a level of comfort. He'd be talking about the West Side, and he'd be say, well, yeah, that was the game against Elder. You know who Elder is, right. Or, then I went down to Price Hill. I went to that place next to that thing. You know where that is on Warsaw Avenue. So there was like a level of comfort, a level of understanding that I think helped.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I've always felt with Pete, like, with all the baggage, despite all the baggage, when he gets one-on-one with somebody, he's pretty charming. I mean, did you find that? Did you find that he was kind of charming you?
So yeah, people have asked me, did he try to charm you? And my answer is what you just said, Jack. I mean, he is just sort of charming, whether you like him or not. And even, this isn't new. I mean, other reporters have said this before, that you can dislike Pete Rose, you can find him crass and obnoxious and insulting, and then you're with him and you find yourself liking him.
Yeah.
And I think there is a certain truth to that. I think more importantly, Pete has a charisma about him. Again, I haven't had access to Pete for about a year and a half. But when I did have access to him, he has a charisma about him. He's got a thing that you feel. You feel it when you're sitting across the table from him. And that was helpful for me to understand. Because, one thing I did was try to interview everyone who crossed paths with Pete during the peak of his fame. So the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And, so we're talking about, it could be, teammates, could be guys he played against. We're also talking about his closest friends, his wives, his girlfriends. And, some of these people, had once had close, intimate relationships with Pete as a friend or a lover. But now we're outside of his world, now had been essentially exiled and were no longer part of his life. And many of those interviews that I did with those folks, they would break down at times and they would actually become emotional. They would actually cry when remembering a certain moment, a certain night in that time they had with Pete Rose. And, again, I've interviewed thousands of people over the years, and people do sometimes become emotional, of course, when telling stories about their own lives. But typically it's involving something truly painful or something truly tragic. And sometimes with these interviews, it wasn't that. Again, they were just recalling a moment, a story, and then they would become emotional. And, I don't think I would have understood that had I not had the chance to meet Pete Rose and spend time with him in person. Because again, even just sitting across the table from him, you feel that charisma, you feel that that attention that he gives you. And I was just feeling a fraction of that, of course, compared to someone who was a close friend but was no longer. And it helped me understand, the pain that these folks felt many decades later.
Did he come through with any kind of remorse, regret? What were Pete's emotions about the whole mess?
Well, in general, about the whole mess, and by that I assume you mean the gambling scandal in particular, I
Yes.
would say he has three emotions. Um, Indignation is still a big one for him. Anger is still a big one for him. And he does express regret, but he doesn't do it in the way that, we would want him to do it. If you ask him, what are your greatest regrets? He'll say that I bet on baseball, and in his mind, he feels like he's apologized for this and handled this and reckoned with this 20 years ago. But the fact is he's never done what we want someone to do when they go astray. And I don't just mean famous people, although we do want this from our famous people when they go astray. We also want it from our friends and our loved ones. If someone hurts us, we want them to give an apology that feels genuine, that feels heartfelt. And Pete struggles to do that. He is simply not wired to do what we want him to do, or to do what we need him to do, to feel like he has reckoned with it. And I think when Pete says, that he has one regret, then it's he bet on baseball, I think that's too simplistic, because the fact is it was the lies, 15 years of lies, about what he did that created the real problem here. This is an opinion. What I'm about to say next. This is I think fact based on my reporting. If Pete is honest back in 1989, and he had multiple chances to be honest back in 1989, the whole story is different. And I don't mean to suggest that he wouldn't have been suspended. I don't mean to suggest that he wouldn't have been even banned. He might have been still. But I don't think it would have been this kind of suspension or the kind of banishment that we are still wrestling with 35 years later. Because again, another thing we've forgotten about Pete Rose is that this was bad for baseball in 1989. This was a stain on the game and bad PR for Major League Baseball. And so if there was a way to soften the blow here, with Pete's admission and reconciliation, that would have been something that was not only good for Pete Rose, it would have been something good for baseball.
There's a passage in your book that I just have to read a part of it. I'm sorry, it's so good. But it's when Pete got summoned in February of '89 to meet with Peter Ueberroth, Bart Giamatti, and Fay Vincent, and they kind of had the goods on him. Even then, and although Pete kind of charmed them, but this is what you write, in terms of this would have been an opportunity to be honest, but Pete couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. The same qualities that made him a successful baseball player, one of the greatest hitters of all time, ensured his failure now. Pete wasn't going to let Paul Jansen win if that's what this was about. He wasn't going to admit to anything in that room on Park Avenue filled with polished men wearing the right kind of suits. He was going to fight his fight as he was taught to do on the west side of Cincinnati in Jimmy Schlank's abandoned swimming pool. He was going to refuse to go down as he did that night in the boxing ring long ago. He was going to listen to his late father, hustle, Pete, keep up the hustle. He was going to foul off the fastball on the outside corner to see another pitch. He was going to bunt the ball down the line to win the batting title. And he was going to take out the catcher at home plate in a meaningless game, breaking his shoulder at the joint. Pete Rose was going to lie. I mean, that just captures the whole thing, I think. I mean, it's just such a great passage.
Oh, thank you,
Keith.
Jack.
I think there's two questions here. Should he be banned from baseball? And I think a lot of people understand the banishment from baseball when you bet on baseball. And then there's the other question about eligibility for the Hall of Fame. And I guess, did you get a sense from your investigation about whether Commissioner Giamatti's death had any impact on the Hall of Fame decision? Because I think a lot of people speculate that Fay Vincent and others almost think that Bart had a heart attack because of the stress he was under, and it was related to Pete Rose.
Yeah, so let's remember some of the details here. Giamatti dies of a cardiac arrest within 8 days of Pete's banishment. Giamatti's entire tenure as commissioner is devoured by Pete Rose. That is like a twist, a tragic twist of Shakespearean proportions, and it's a devastating one. I think Bart Giamatti was probably the most intelligent commissioner we've ever had of any sports league. And I do wonder lots of things, about lots of things if he had lived. Would the steroids scandal have been handled in the same way? Would they have ignored it as they did in the 90s? Or would Giamatti have peeled off the curtain on that as well, just as he did on Rose's gambling? So many questions. So because of that, as you said, Randy, there was speculation even in the moment. On the day that Giamatti died, people are on sports radio saying Rose killed him. So this is out there. And it's a common thing that you hear. And the other common thing you hear as Cincinnatians is that Giamatti had a vendetta against Pete Rose. Again, that isn't true. Again, as I said before, this was bad for baseball in '89. Giamatti was a man of empathy. He wanted nothing more than Rose to admit what he did and let's try to rebuild him. Rose couldn't do that. He continued to lie even when they had the goods on him. Major League Baseball had no other choice. But two things to your question that I think are critical. When Rose accepts his banishment in August 1989, and he does accept it, he signs the document accepting his banishment. He knows full well that his name will appear on the ballot at Cooperstown 2 years later in 1991, which would have been 5 years after Pete's last at bat as a player. So he signs his banishment knowing, okay, fine, but I'm going to get into the Hall of Fame and I'll be okay. In February 1991, 10 months before his name would have appeared on the ballot, Cooperstown changes the rules and says that only eligible players may appear on the ballot. Effectively, it's the Pete Rose corollary. They remove him from the ballot, with a rule change. And, I did interview Fay Vincent at length many times. He was very generous with his time. He is one of the most intelligent men I have ever interviewed. And Vincent says that, Major League Baseball had nothing to do with this rule change. I do find that a little bit hard to believe. Cooperstown and the Hall of Fame, does sort of work in partnership with Major League Baseball, of course. So I do find that hard to believe. But I don't think that Giamatti's death exactly led to the long-time banishment of Pete Rose, the banishment we're still wrestling with today. It of course, didn't help at all. But I don't think that is as interesting as this other sort of speculative question. As I mentioned before, Giamatti was a man of empathy. He rises to the post as commissioner not because he's a lawyer or a businessman or even a ball player. He gets there because he loves baseball. And Giamatti is, even though he's so intelligent and so learned, is the kind of person who can have lunch with the president of the United States, and he did do that, and also go hang out in the Reds dugout and, yuck it up with the players. He did that too. He was a likable person, a man of empathy. And I think what's more interesting is this. I think if Giamatti lives, Giamatti finds a way in the early 90s to coax Rose out of the corner that he has painted himself into. I can see a scenario where Giamatti, goes to Rose in the early 90s with this scandal still hanging over baseball, still hanging over Rose, and basically coaxes him to come out and tell the truth. And if he does that, say in 1991 or 92 or somewhere like that, I think it's all different. Instead, Giamatti dies. Yes, there are certain people who hold that against Pete Rose. Pete, paints himself into this corner, and that's it. And we're now locked into this entrenched debate for the next 15 years.
You've used up a lot of your time, and we're kind of running up on the clock, but I was attracted to your book by the subtitle, The Last Glory Days of Baseball. And I wonder if you could just expound upon how you chose that subtitle.
Well, let me be clear. I'm still a baseball fan today, and I still love the game. I still love going to games. But I think it'd be folly to suggest that things haven't changed. Major League Baseball in the 1960s and 70s, carved out a much bigger slice of the American consciousness than it does today. I would submit to you that the average American can't even tell you who played in the World Series last fall. It is just shrunk in terms of what it means to society. And so, what I was trying to capture with that subtitle is Rose is there for this last great moment when baseball is significant, to American culture and to most Americans. And Pete is there for 30 years, guys. I mean, it's a stunning time, right? He's a rookie minor leaguer in 1960. He's banned from baseball as a manager in 1989, 30 professional seasons. And even in that time, the game changes. It changes from this unpolished, raw national pastime that is incredibly popular with Americans and indeed our most popular sport. And it changes over the course of those 30 years to a much more profitable corporate sport, very polished with billion-dollar television contracts. But by 1989, the NFL and professional football is already far more popular than Major League Baseball. And that is even more true today, 35 years later. And so that was really what I was trying to capture, with that subtitle.
So I wanted to change gears just a little bit. And I appreciate your time. But, with Randy and I growing up in the 60s and the 70s, Carolyn Rose was locally almost as big a celebrity as Pete. And I know you talked to her a couple of times in your reporting. How's she doing? She's kind of disappeared to a certain extent. Is she doing okay? I mean, how would you say she's doing?
Carolyn Rose, obviously Pete Rose's first wife. They're married for 15 years. And you're absolutely right. And I say this all the time for folks who didn't grow up in Cincinnati. But, by the 1970s, Carolyn is just as popular as Pete is, maybe even more so. She was this ebullient personality, also, would say and do whatever she wanted, just like Pete. It was a media darling in Cincinnati. And she is, one of those people, like I mentioned before, that is, had once had this close, access to Pete and has now been long exiled to the fringes of this universe. And without question, that hurt Carolyn. And in my interviews with Pete, I can tell you that she still, has, feelings for him. And those feelings run the gamut, is what I'm saying. She feels everything very strongly when talking about Pete Rose. But as she told me, she had no choice but to file for divorce in 1979. She had endured many insults, over the years, and fought through those. But by 1979, as she said, she had a teenage daughter, and she told me that she needed to file for divorce because she wanted her daughter to know that you can't let a man treat you in the way she had been treated by Pete. And so even though it hurt her financially, it hurt her reputationally, and certainly in divorcing Pete, she loses access to that world that she loved, this world of baseball. She had no choice but to divorce him.
I'm sort of intrigued by an element in Cincinnati that does have sort of an unconditional love or tolerance for Pete. And I feel like I see it. The other person who I see it with is Bob Huggins. That there's just this almost, that's our guy, come what may. Do you think that's a unique aspect of Cincinnati? Do you think there's other cities that sort of are that, unconditional about their love of their heroes, or do you think we're unique in that respect?
I think there are lots of cities that and fan bases that are willing to look past the obvious foibles of their stars in order to keep supporting them. I think that's a classic, almost cliched fan reaction. I do think those two guys you just mentioned, though, about Cincinnati, Huggins and Rose, are interesting, though. And as a Cincinnatian, I think what those two have in common, I would say, are this. They are both white guys. They are both working class guys who embrace that working class mentality, who are willing to say whatever they want and have these people who will constantly defend them for the things that they say and do. And I think, that's an interesting thing that you've identified there, about those two particular men, and Cincinnati.
Yeah. Well, so you don't take or at least my last question, Randy. I don't want to jump on you, but does Pete belong in the Hall of Fame?
That's the $64 million question, right? Or as he would
Yeah.
say, it's the $100 million question.
Hey.
He argues that he probably lost $100 million, but having been banned in 1989. Like a lot of Cincinnatians, I have struggled with this question over the years, and really have sort of, felt every emotion about it. And to be clear, as my book isn't about taking sides. I'm
Right.
not here to make a case for Pete. I'm not here to make a case against Pete. I just tried to lay out the story, and people can read it and then come to their own conclusions. I think you can latch on to lots of different things in my book to defend whatever position you want to take on this question. My feeling at this point about that question as a fan is this. I think in general, we have lost perspective when it comes to our athletic halls of fame. We like to put our athletes on pedestals, and ascribe to them moral values that they may or may not deserve, that they may or may not have. And the fact is, we just don't really know that much about them. We really don't. All we really know for sure is what happened on the field or on the court. We simply don't know what we don't know about these athletes. And so, for that reason, for me, in a blanket way, when it comes to Pete Rose and all of baseball's ne'er-do-wells, and by that I mean the Roger Clemens and the Barry Bonds and the A-Rods of the world, I have really come full circle. And I now believe that players should be enshrined into the hall if what they did on the field was enough. And then if their mistakes off the field are so egregious or so wrong, then let's put it on the plaque, at Cooperstown. Let's put it there for perpetuity right next to their accomplishments. That's my opinion now about the Hall of Fame.
Totally agree. I think 35 years is long enough for, is that right? 35 years, I hate to be too silly, but he could have shot Bart Giamatti and sentenced to about 20 years probably. But I think we've taken up a lot of your time, Keith. We really appreciate it. The book is outstanding. And I think on behalf of Jack and myself, we can't thank you enough for giving us the time today.
Thanks, Keith.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. My pleasure.
Well, Jack, that was tremendous. Jack, another standing ovation.